Hey, what's up everybody? It's Ollie from flightcomp, and today we're going to take a look at the new Samba Models Prestige 2PK. This is my pre-production model, and it's the light version. Instead of kind of going over the whole model, I'm actually going to just build this model, and then I'll give you a quick look at all the parts piece by piece as I go along with my build. So this is a three-piece wing, and this is the tip. It's a solid core foam wing. So Samba has finally moved away from the traditional two-piece hollow molded wings that we saw with the Perfection and the Dynamic. There's the bottom. So this is a 4-meter airplane, and comparatively the wingtips are really short. The center panel is much bigger than 1.5 meters. So it has a very long center panel and short tip panels. It feels real light. The quality's pretty good. Again, this is pre-production, so they're still kind of working out their production bugs when I got this model. Here's a servo pocket here. We have like a square wing joiner here, and then we have metal alignment pins. The interesting thing about this servo pocket is that it's fully boxed in. This seems to be like a composite, I don't know if it's fiberglass or carbon fiber box, but it's fully boxed in, which is really nice because it actually I think it provides a lot of strength to where the servo mounts. Okay, so they say, Samba says this was designed to use these Servo Arm LDS type frames. It's, so this was supplied with my model. It says for MKS 6110 foam, and this servo mount slips right into this pocket here, and I guess you'd have to install the horns for the LDS in the surface here. But I'm not going to use these. I don't like these, and I'll tell you why. I have had several models with these setups, and especially on the ailerons, the control horns in the wings are just way too small, because it's supposed to be IDS or LDS and keep everything flush and nothing sticking out of the top surface. So you end up with a really small control horn. So you end up cutting your EPAs, your endpoints, and your servo limits down to less than 50%. I've had models where I had to turn down my servo limits to 30% or less. And that just robs your servo of all its power and precision. And what ends up happening is you put one click of subtrim in your servo and your surface moves like 2 or 3 millimeters. And it makes it really hard to get all your surfaces lined up, especially in your various camber settings. And any servo is prone to double center when it's only using 30% of its throws. So I'm not going to use this. I'm not going to use this Servo Arm IDS. I'm going to put a regular control horn in here, like a Vertigo or Ultima or a Volo or something, just sticking out. I have some Vertigo control horns laying around, so I'm going to use those. Anyway, let's get on with the build. I'm going to start with positioning the horn and figuring out where I need to put my servo, because I will be using KST X08s in this, since this is a light model. So I'm going to use the X08, and I'm going to use these RC Solutions wood frames. And as you can see, there's plenty of room in this bay for the servos. You can fit, an X10 Mini or a 6130 kind of servo in there even. So I'm going to move on with installing the horns. Alright, we've finished cutting the slot for the control horns, and they're in place, but they're not glued in yet. The next thing we're going to do is cut a slot here for the linkage to pass through. So I've measured 4 millimeters from the hinge here and 12 millimeters back, and it's 1.5 millimeters wide. And I'm going to cut the skin away with a brand new X-Acto knife. And then I'll just use a small file like this to remove some of the foam. And then we're going to also have to go in from the bottom of the wing and also open up a slot in the servo bay as well. But I'm going to start with this top skin here. Alright, I made the slot for the linkages to pass through. I've made my linkage. I've bent it on both sides. If you see the other tip here, it's hooked up to the servo. So I made both of the bends and then put the wire in, and I made this bend as short as possible because you have to kind of push it through the foam, and you want to keep it short so you don't damage your wing when you push it through. So I'm going to remove this servo. These are the servos I'm using. They're in frames, and they have a little bit of plastic underneath them to protect them from any resin. What I'm going to do is remove the servos and just glue in the linkages. And once that epoxy is cured, then I'm going to install the servos. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Here's a little closer look at the slot I cut in this composite box. Turns out this is composite, and it's very thin actually, so it's easy to cut through. So I just cut a little slot in there with a Dremel and a file. There's no problem at all. Okay, I didn't go over this, but to locate my control horns, all I did was I measured from the edge of the servo bay about 6 millimeters from this edge here. I marked the location, and then I just used a square on the hinge line, drew the line, and then did the same thing again here, again using the hinge line as a reference to make sure the horn's perpendicular. Continued the line, and then transferred that line to the top. You can see that mark there, and that's the line there. So that indicates the point where the linkage exits the wing. And then I just moved over from that line 1 millimeter, and that's where I cut the slot in for the control horn. So that's how I got that location. Alright, we've got our control horn slots filled with epoxy, and we're just going to push the control horns in and let them cure overnight. So I'm going to go ahead and get those control horns in place. So that's how it looks when they're installed. I'm going to let this epoxy kind of cure up for a couple of hours, maybe 4 or 5 hours, and it'll get kind of it'll get set, but it'll still be kind of rubbery. And at that point, I'm going to peel the tape off. You can peel it off now too if you want, if you're really careful, but I'm just going to wait a little bit and then peel the tape off. That basically completes the control horns. After this is all cured, we can move on to actually getting the servos installed into the bay. So our control horns are installed and the epoxy is cured. You can see right there, very clean installation. And we're ready to move on with installing the servos. I've scuffed up this servo bay so it can accept some epoxy. And then I've prepared my servo to KST X08 in a RC Solutions frame, and just a little bit of plastic between the servo and the frame itself to keep all the epoxy off the servo. And then I've taped up the aileron so it doesn't move and it's in the neutral position, matched it to the center panel. And I'm just going to mix up some epoxy, thicken it a little bit with Cabasil, push the servo in, make sure it's perpendicular to the hinge line, this hinge line, and then I'm just going to put some weight on it and let it fully cure. I'm going to use 24-hour slow cure epoxy, so high quality epoxy, not 5-minute or 15-minute or 30-minute or anything like that. So I'm going to get on with that. I'm going to put both the servos in, and then that'll almost wrap up the servo installation. My model didn't have the opening cut for the wire to pass through. Again, this is pre-production, so I'm sure your model will have that already available to you. Yeah, let's go ahead and get the servos in. One more thing I wanted to mention is that I'm using, with the X08, I'm using the single-sided servo arm, which is just the servo arm with one side, and I'm using the first hole. You can see my servo arm is really short. So basically it's about 5 millimeters from the center of the shaft to that hole. So we're looking at a 5 millimeter arm here. So this should allow me to use the majority of the servo travel available in the servo. Servos are now in place. I have epoxied them in place on both tips. They're in the right positions. They're perpendicular and parallel to the linkage and the hinge lines. And we have some ballast slugs holding them down, so we'll just let this sit for at least 12 hours or so, and then we can come back to this and wrap up the wingtips. Alright, we have our servos installed. The glue is cured, the epoxy, and actually have the servo hooked up to a tester here, and we're able to use a majority of the throw on the X08. As you can see, we're hitting the mechanical stop here, and we get plenty of down throw. So I would say we're going to be able to use, 85%, 90% of the available throw of the servo. So we're going to get as much power and precision out of the servo as possible. And we did that because we're using a external control horn here. So the height from this pivot point to the bottom of the hinge is probably double of what the Servo Arm control horn would be for an internal IDS setup. And I would imagine that the Servo Arm hub is going to have a similar offset, probably something like 5 millimeters, maybe 4 to 5 millimeters. So we'd have a similar distance here on our servo hub with IDS, but we'd have probably half the distance at the control horn, which would mean we'd be using at least half the travel available only. So really, in my opinion, it might offer marginal aerodynamic benefits to not have these control horns, but I'd rather have servos that don't double center and that have plenty of power. So yeah, that's it. I also cut a hole here for the wire, and I ran the wire through. And basically it. I need to cut the hole on the other tip, but right now what I'm going to do is just put the servo cover on here, and maybe put a little bit of clear packing tape around the edge here to protect the paint from the tape that we use when we join the tips to the center panel. So I put some packing tape on the edge of the wingtip, top and bottom. We have the servo wire pulled through here. And then I put a really thin carbon fiber cover on with some thin capped-on tape, basically just clear tape. Yeah, my kit didn't come with covers, so I just had some carbon covers laying around from something else. I don't know what. I just used those. Again, this is pre-production, so there are the tips ready to rock. So, let's put these aside, and we'll move on to either the center panel, or we might move on to the fuselage. I don't know, but we'll move on to something. So look out for the next video in the Pike Prestige series.